climate change is probably a menace to the existence of the human species. So the natural environment are therefore badly impacted. In the short term, this threat is going to hit some more than others. It is a threat that in the short term will impact on certain regions, on some part of the population, on the poorest people, on those who have less possibility to defend themselves, who have less access to resources and technology. But of course, there are some people who have to withstand and bear the burden. The Katrina hurricane in New York, or more recent hurricanes of the last few weeks, or floods, are providing evidence of all this. So these changes are striking us in an unprecedented manner and in a very unequal manner. So my first question, Amita Ghosh, can we say that our idea of freedom is being questioned at a point in time when resources become more scarce? So when our access to water, to earth, to land is put in danger?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think, in some profound sense, the entire problem of climate change is very closely related to conceptions of freedom. And of course, everybody understands this. I mean, you will have seen that in the United States, the far right, that's what they're always complaining about. They think that climate change is a hoax to take away their freedom. But absolutely, these notions of freedom that we have, that we have had, that we can consume forever, we can consume exactly what we want all the time. All of these ideas are being limited now by climate change. Uh, you know, I think we have to relate climate change back to certain ideas, about the world, about freedom, for example, but also about individualism. It's interesting that we are here at a festival of economics because economics as a discipline is founded so much on the idea of individuals, freedom of choice, individual choice, and so on and so forth. But I think this always used to be seen as some individualism used to be seen as something very positive in the West. But what we see now is that individualism of a certain kind can become extremely dangerous. And we see this, the clearest illustration of this is during this COVID pandemic, when we see in large parts of America people completely refusing to wear masks. I mean, the science is now absolutely clear that just wearing a mask can help reduce deaths, can help cut down on deaths, and yet people refuse to wear masks because they see it in terms of liberty. Now, that's what I call morbid individualism. And I think that's what we are seeing more and more. So earlier, Marina, you made an interesting point about who is going to be affected by climate change, who is going to be worse hit by climate change. Again, I don't think that the correlations are very simple, you know, because it used to be said the poor will suffer most and so on and so forth. But if you take this COVID pandemic as an indicator, we can see that gross national wealth, GDP, is a very poor indicator of how countries have fared during this crisis. Vietnam, for example, which has a tiny per capita income, has come out of this crisis incredibly well. The same is true of Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, at the start of this crisis, everyone said, I remember especially Melinda Gates and so on and so forth. They came out and said, oh, Africa is going to collapse. It's going to be terrible for Africa and so on. But Africans have actually handled the COVID crisis much better than many countries. I mean, at a certain point, Somalia was sending doctors to Italy, you know, so I think the idea that we've had and which has consistently been sold to us that the rich will be fine, the poor will suffer is a very crude idea. I don't think it's going to work in quite that way.
doesn't function necessarily for the pandemic, which is a problem that we're facing in these months, but actually we see here that having to deal with the ecological crisis in general terms or the pandemic in more specific terms requires that we deal with these issues, for example, in terms of the healthcare services being curtailed due to the public spending cuts. So in this sense, this is very true. It is not a matter of rich or poor countries, but rather it's a matter of countries that are endowed with instruments that make it possible to collectively act through the healthcare system, for example, education, and so on. But maybe we're widening the scope too much, and I think it's interesting to see. It's been interesting to see that during the pandemic, the problem of freedom has emerged, for example, as a refusal to wear masks or abiding by certain constraints and limitations. I understand it's a quite complicated issue. In fact, some of the limitations and some of the constraints imposed upon personal freedom may be useful and may be necessary, absolutely necessary, to face a collective problem. The problem is whether these limitations or whether a series of controls and the state of control brought about by the epidemic will become a permanent waiver of freedom, or if it is only confined to the epidemic or phase or to the pandemic era. But let's go back to the ecological crisis and to the climate changes. This is an issue that includes anything such as ecological crisis on the planet. In fact, there is a problem of power distribution and equality when talking about climate changes, and I think you have written very clearly on the topic. So in the great blindness, so everybody, so in the derangement, everybody talks about having equitable politics when dealing with the climate. But if we try and get an understanding of how these function in different countries, we will discover that in Europe, in the United States, in the most industrialized countries, we should cut our consumption of fossil fuels, reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases by 80, 90%. So we should change dramatically our lifestyles. Are we ready to do this? And probably one may wonder whether this is possible. At this point, the issue of power, of the access of resources comes into play. So who is consuming more? Who is consuming less? And you wrote that faced with the climate change threat, there is a kind of attitude such as that of the armed crew, as an armed crew. And
Sorry, I can't hear you. Hello? The audio is gone. I can't.
Shall I repeat? Can you hear now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, please repeat. No, audio's gone again.
1, 2, 3, testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
yes.
great. Thank you.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm not getting any audio. I'm sorry, I'm not getting any audio.
Posso ripetere?
Right, I'll repeat the question. No, I'm sure.
Sì.
Right. So the problem of the climate will require a dramatic cutting of our lifestyle, our energy consumption, and so on and so forth. And you said that when confronted with the threat of the climate, the powerful nations react with the politics of the armed lifeboat. Can you please explain to us what you mean by that?
Well, the politics of the armed lifeboat. It was an idea that the ethics of the armed lifeboat, etc. It was an idea put forth by a right-wing ecological thinker called Garrett Hardin. Garrett Hardin was also the guy who wrote a very influential article on the tragedy of the commons. He was a well-known right-wing ideologue, and ethnic. He was a sort of believed in white supremacy and so on and so forth. So his argument in the politics of the armed lifeboat is that when a lifeboat is about to, he thought of the rich countries as lifeboats, and of the poor of the world as people who are drowning in the sea and trying to climb on to the lifeboat. So that was the metaphor, and he makes it very clear in this argument that he is arguing metaphorically. And he says this is the metaphor of the world today. The rich countries are like armed lifeboats, and it is in their interest to keep the poor out. Because, if they let the poor in, then the lifeboat itself will collapse. And, without this being explicitly acknowledged, especially the countries of the Anglosphere, that is to say, England and the settler colonies, the four major settler colonies, have quite self-consciously been using this as the foundation of their politics. And the leader of this, of course, was Australia, which went to extraordinary lengths to drive away refugees who were turning up at the borders and so on. And this policy has a kind of incredible hold on the English-speaking imagination, I have to say, because fundamentally you saw a Brexit came about because of fears of migration. Similarly, Trumpism is essentially founded upon this idea of keeping out migrants, hence this idea of building a wall, and so on and so forth. So, already it's quite clear that some of the world's major countries, including the United States, Australia, and so on, I mean, they do have a plan for climate change. Their plan is to keep everyone else out. But is this actually a plan? Now, earlier you talked about inequality in relation to climate change and in relation to the pandemic. I think that's a very important issue because we can't to include the pandemic in a discussion of the ecological crisis is not, I think, to widen the discussion too much. I mean, they're all interrelated phenomena. The pandemic, the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, all of these are, they're not caused by each other necessarily, but they're all effects of the same thing, which is the enormous acceleration that we've seen in the world in these last 30 years. So in that sense, I think, the pandemic can be taken as a good predictor of how the world is going to respond to the widening planetary crisis, which is not just climate change or the pandemic. It's an interrelated series of crises. And in that way, I think the pandemic really gives us a preview of what lies ahead. And the one thing we can see in relation to this pandemic is that the best predictor for how countries will respond to this crisis is not It is not gross wealth, it's not GDP, it's not gross per capita income. Rather, it's inequality. The three countries that have done very, very badly, the three countries that have fared the worst, are the three most unequal countries. The United States, India, and Brazil. These are the countries that are so massively divided in terms of ethnic differences of class, race, etc. So I think this is actually going to be the real picture of what lies ahead with the planetary crisis. So this adds another dimension, to the whole idea of the politics of the armed lifeboat. So when Gareth Hardin and other right-wing thinkers think that that the rich country is a lifeboat, they're fundamentally wrong. It's only parts of the rich countries that are in a lifeboat. It's not the country as a whole that's in a lifeboat. Large parts of the rich countries are actually also drowning in the sea, and they will also be kept out of the lifeboats. The only lifeboats that now exist in the planetary crisis are those that belong to the ultra rich. They're the ones who have their getaways in their hideaways in New Zealand and in other parts of the world and so on. They're all prepared to take off in helicopters and jets as soon as the crisis starts to unfold. So, the really sad thing about Gareth Hardin's argument about the politics of the armed lifeboat is that he himself would have been left to drown. Because he clearly thought of himself as a white man, that he's safe in his lifeboat, but that's not the case. uh, you know poor white people or even middle class white people are going to be left out of the lifeboat just as much as black people, as brown people, as migrants. So, in effect, I mean, this whole idea that that a rich country is in some way a lifeboat is a completely deranged notion. It's not at all the case.
vero ed è
That's very, very true. But it is also true that wealthy, rich, industrialized countries still think of themselves as of a privileged country, as a lifeboat. And they see themselves as people having the right to continue with their lifestyle, with their economic system, which is based on fossil fuels. Even though there is a lively debate about this, but after all, that's the system we have developed so far, and we have some difficulties in imagining a transformation of this system. But I was also thinking about another aspect, back to the armed lifeboat and the poor people trying to find a place on this presumed lifeboat. In a certain sense, this is a metaphor, but this is actually happening in real life. Amongst the reasons why people migrate, and there are many, many different reasons, of course. Many people have their own personal reasons, others have collective reasons, but one of the collective reasons is, for sure, the transformation of our environment and climate change, with all the consequences it implies and the impact of climate change, which is not allowing people to survive in their own country. So sometimes we talk about environmental refugees. This is a vague definition. Maybe we should see the reasons why these people migrate, but for sure the ecological crisis is one of the reasons pushing these people away from their countries and making migration necessary. I was actually mentioning the most recent events, and there's one of them which is really terrible, which is a fire on the Lesbos island in Greece in a refugee camp. This has nothing to do directly with the climate change, but it has to do with the failure of European migration policies. However, it also makes us think of another important theme, because we know that one of the impacts of climate change, which is often evoked, is the movement of masses of people who will be obliged to leave their country because of extreme climatic events, drought, floods, and many other related reasons. Conversely, in Europe and in the United States, so to say, in the so-called wealthy countries that view themselves as a lifeboat, well, these countries refuse these people. They see them as a burden. They're afraid of them. So the armed lifeboat is not a metaphor in this sense. It is a real situation. So do you think that also what I've described is a description of the armed lifeboat?
That's a very interesting point, Marina. Yes, certainly. I mean, it's absolutely true that Europe as well is literally implementing the politics of the armed lifeboat. I mean, now they're actually sending out. Many countries in Europe are sending out naval ships in order to keep these boatloads of migrants away from their borders. And it has also led, in another way, to a deeper and deeper intervention. For example, Italy has now tried to push to stop migration at the source levels. It's tried to shut down those migration routes within Africa and within Asia, with very little success. So, the first thing that this tells us is that obviously the world has to have some sort of collective response, and it has not had a collective response, and that's going to be a source of increasing unrest around the world. It's going to be a source of increasing conflict. But remember also that there are also massive internal displacements occurring, and this is not just in the poorest parts of the world. I've just been reading a very interesting book by our common friend Stefano Liberti, the journalist, and the book is called Terra Bruciata. It's just come out from Rizzoli, and over there he interviews some people who were displaced by the flooding in the region called at the mouth of the Po River. It's called Polesine or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it. But in 1951, after a major flood, 180,000 people were displaced. And they've never gone back. And that area has continued to lose tens of thousands of people over the years. And let's not forget, this is actually in the Veneto. This is one of the richest parts of Italy. It's not as if it's even, in the south of Italy or something. So, I really think that we have to get rid of this idea that, that the poorest parts of the world are going to be hit hardest. Because one of the things we see, it's perfectly clear now, is that Italy is one of the countries that is being hardest hit by climate change. There's more and more evidence of this. You can see it in the droughts in Sicily. You can see it in the sudden sorts of, the sudden rain bomb events that have been hitting in Italy recently. Most of all, and this is the point that Stefano Liberti makes at great length in his book, it's the shrinking of the alpine glaciers that's going to be a major problem for Italy in the long run, especially for the Po. The Po River is just so important for Italy, and if the alpine glaciers dry up, it's going to be another major issue for Italy to face. So, we are facing this. Every country in the world now is in one way or the other facing, a catastrophe. It's a multi-dimensional catastrophe that is unfolding in very strange ways. And often, one of the strangest things about this catastrophe is that often it's the richest people who are in the way of the worst climate change impacts. Consider, for example, a city like Houston. Houston is it's the global hub of the fossil fuel industry. It's the fourth largest city in the United States. It's a place of immense wealth. But over the last few years, it's become more and more clear that Houston, in the long run, is probably not going to be a sustainable place to live because they've had flood after flood. Many of these floods have very badly affected middle class and wealthy people, as well as poor people. We see this also in these California fires, which have hit many extremely wealthy areas. So, in a sense, there is no lifeboat. That's the thing that we are seeing now. The waves around us are so high that no lifeboat can protect you from it.
In Europe and in Italy, we have transformed the environment. We have transformed in the last 100 years the environment impressively. So it's very true. We are talking about issues that are striking the entire world and our countries in particular. But let me go back to the idea of freedom that we mentioned at the very start of our conversation. You write about the idea or conviction that human beings have an unlimited freedom is what prevents us from seeing and recognizing and facing the ecological crisis. For example, in the Great Derangement, in your essay, you mention the encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis Laudato Si, which stresses the problems caused by climate changes, which the Pope links to social issues, ecology, poverty, as well as justice, have to be faced all together. You can't resolve one problem if you don't solve or consider the other. And this applies to rich countries as well as within every single country. But you also mentioned this because it questions one of the certainty of modernity, so the power of man over nature. So the idea that human beings have no limitations, the idea that men can forge the surrounding environment as much as they want and can tame the environment, an idea which has then been argued about by many ecologists, for example, and after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, there had been an in-depth debate in Italy among scientists, women, feminists, concerning the awareness, our awareness of limitations. Human beings have no limitations, or in terms of bending nature to its own will, to his own will. We need to be aware of our own limits and limitations. So the idea of freedom, of an unlimited freedom, that it doesn't make it possible for us to recognize the ecological crisis. Are you referring to the Prometheic idea of human beings dominating nature? Is this what we should question in a way?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, we must. I mean, it's perfectly clear that human beings, far from dominating nature, are completely at nature's mercy. In many ways, this moment of the planetary crisis, as I think of it, is comparable, to a moment in the 18th century uh, when Lisbon was completely destroyed by a great earthquake. And that great earthquake suddenly, already back then in the 18th century, European Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire and so on, believed that the humans had already conquered nature, had already sort of dominated nature and so on and so forth. And when Lisbon was destroyed in this way, suddenly they woke up and said, "Oh my God, no, it's not quite so simple." But we haven't changed since then. And of course, this is completely attributable to the European Enlightenment. It is entirely an Enlightenment idea, going back to, say, Francis Bacon and René Descartes and so on, who literally believed that, nature had to be tortured in order to extract its secrets, and thereafter, they used these metaphors. You perhaps know of Carolyn Merchant's work, who showed so clearly that how important these ideas of torture were to the development of early science. So yes, I do think that uh, Western science and technology has given us this kind of completely perverse idea of the relationships between human beings and the world beyond. But let us not forget, these ideas are all elite ideas. The peasantry, the farmers, the people who live close to the land, even in the West to this day, don't subscribe to these ideas. That's what is so strange about this whole thing. That a tiny minority, basically, of Europeans and Westerners, manage to impose their beliefs about the world on the rest of the world, and continue to do so. I can assure you, and I'm sure you know this also, if you speak to, ordinary farming people in Italy, in Sicily, wherever, they won't tell you that, they won't say to you that humans have dominated nature, conquered nature, anything of that kind. And certainly they will not say that to you in India or Indonesia or in Africa. This is an elite idea. It's an elite idea that has been forcibly imposed upon the rest of the world through colonialism, imperialism, and conquest. That's all there is to it. But again, what is so interesting again is this is the argument that you were making earlier uh, about uh, uh, about the nature of ecological interventions. So if you if you look at what is happening around the world today, the places that are actually being worst hit. I don't know if you've ever read Alfred Crosby, the ecological historian who wrote a very powerful book in the 70s called Ecological. It was a sort of ecological history. It's called Ecological Imperialism. And what Crosby and many other ecological historians have shown is that imperialism fundamentally was an ecological project. It was a project of remaking the three continents of the New World into what Crosby calls Neo Europes, that is, New Europes. Now, if you look today, where the worst impacts of climate change are unfolding, it is exactly in those parts of the world that have been most extensively re engineered to look like Neo Europes. So, California, southeastern Australia, a lot of these places are actually within the Anglosphere because they were the ones who did the biggest ecological interventions. So, the Midwest, which is now the Missouri River, is absolutely overwhelming. 2 centuries of ecological interventions. So here again, we see, and this is true also of what happened in the colonies. I mean, Bombay as a city exists because of massive ecological interventions in a landscape which is completely unsuited. Like the Po Delta, Bombay is built upon a delta region, and increasingly we see that with sea level rise, this delta region will go back to being half water, you know. So, this is actually one of the curious aspects of the planetary crisis. Those parts of the world that are actually being now, it's almost as if the land itself is rising up to throw off, the forms that were imposed on it in this through this period of colonialism and imperialism. And I think again, you mentioned Pope Francis and Laudato Si. Last week, I did an event with the mayor of Assisi, and she told me that Pope Francis is about to release another encyclical, which is related to climate and environment and so on. And apparently, he is going to release it in Assisi on the grave of Saint Francis. As you know, and as I've written in my book, I think Pope Francis is one of the great visionary leaders of the world today. And the reason why he is a great visionary leader of the world is because he doesn't speak in terms of the dead ecological forms of thinking uh, that go back to 19th century Europe. He is really talking about a human kinship with other beings. And that is what is so important. This is the language that comes to us. This is the framework that comes to us from indigenous traditions, especially North American indigenous traditions, who've always defended the land uh, on behalf of what they call our other relatives. And by the relatives, they mean rivers, they mean the land, they mean animals, and they mean the past, the ghosts of the past. And this is what is so striking to me about the language of that Pope Francis uses. It's a complete departure from what you might call a post-enlightenment kind of Christianity, or indeed a post-enlightenment way of thinking about the world.
Well, first of all, I would like to see if there are any questions from our audience. I know that many people are connected online, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. We still have a couple of minutes. But in the meantime, I would like to ask you a question. Do you see any signs of hope? I know that it is difficult. I know that the climate change is becoming more and more serious. We're imprisoned in a worldwide pandemic. I mean, all what we said so far. But are there any signs of hope? Any signs of a reaction? Maybe a reaction from the bottom. You mentioned the fact that the people living on agriculture all over the world, they have never thought that men could dominate nature. They know perfectly well that they have to accept nature. But I'm thinking of new movements, like the one started by Greta Thunberg, that has involved many young people, or Extinction Rebellion, or popular movement all over the world. There is some opposition, say, to the building of a dam, to the exploitment of a mine, to those works of development, between inverted commas, that actually aggravate our debt with nature. So do you see any signs of hope?
Yes, absolutely. I think these new movements, as you say, that have started up, for example, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, all these movements are to me signs of great hope. Now, I should say to you that we are calling them new movements, but we can see that they have a generic connection with earlier movements, such as, for example, um, Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street, in turn, has connections with the anti-globalization movements of the late 90s, which in turn has connections with the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement in turn has connections with Gandhian nonviolence. Gandhian nonviolence in turn harks back to a whole tradition of resistance, if you like, that goes back to the resistance to enclosure acts in England in the 19th century and much further. So what we see actually is, just as these mechanistic ideas were being put in place by European elites, that there was a counter tradition of resistance, and this counter tradition of resistance was most powerful, if you like, amongst indigenous peoples in the Americas and in Australia, and it was also very, very powerful amongst African Americans. It's what Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition, which always drew upon other sources, upon sources of if you like, of non-mechanistic ideas of the world, I mean, vitalist ideas of the world. And of course, at the moment you look back on this history, you can see that even as mechanism was rising to dominance, there was always a very strong countervailing tradition, a vitalist tradition, which was constantly suppressed. So this is what I see. These new movements that are coming into being around the world are not in any way new. They go straight back to the Industrial Revolution and even earlier to the 17th century. In Italy, you had Campanella, in Naples, and so on. So this is a long tradition. And this tradition is now suddenly bursting forth. Why is it bursting forth? It's because everybody can see now perfectly clearly that these mechanistic ideas of the world, these mechanistic enlightenment views of mechanistic modernity is collapsing around us. We can see it. Everybody can see it. Now it's become perfectly clear. And the forms of politics that are increasingly proving to be ineffective are actually those forms of, let's say, green politics that rely upon those old mechanistic models of understanding the world. What we are seeing here is something quite different. And if you've been to any of the Occupy movements, or if you've been to a Black Lives Matter movement, or any of these movements, you can see that they're drawing their energy from a completely different source, a metaphysical source that is completely different from uh, mechanistic modernity, if you like.
The problem will be that of achieving efficacy with these movements, with this resistance, in order to influence political decisions. But I don't think that we will be able to solve this problem this evening. However, we have to think about it. We have to make these forms of resistance effective. The people wielding the power today seem to be totally waterproof with regard to this crisis, which is so evident to all of us. They are blind to it. I haven't received any questions from the people who are following us on the internet. Therefore, I would like to thank Amitav Ghosh for participating in the Festival dell'Economia di Trento. Thank you very much for widening the horizon of our debate and for being with us. I would like to thank the City of Trento, the beautiful theatre hosting us, and the Festival dell'Economia for bringing all these topics into the debate, especially how the climate crisis demands that we rethink about our idea of freedom. Thank you very much, Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you to the festival. I feel very deprived that I never got to see Trento, which I believe is a beautiful city. But thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for hosting this event.
Well, hopefully next time you'll be able to come in person. With no pandemics, you will be able to visit Trento and be our physical guest.
I certainly hope so. Thank you. Thank you.